Could you say something about the process of creating that opera with Rhiannon?
Yes. So Rhiannon, for people who don't know her, is an amazing artist, and you should listen to her music now because you will be a better person. But not just like in a not in an intellectual way, but it will cause you to feel and experience life in a way that will enhance your life.
Mm.
She's known as a, I guess you would call her a folk artist, or they put her in a genre called Americana. And all artists kind of bristle against genres. They come after the music, not before the music.
Right.
But anyway, so she's a singer-songwriter. And she plays banjo. I think she won the Steve Martin Award for her banjo playing.
Yes.
She's a MacArthur genius. She's a Grammy winner, and all these things are very well deserved. And when she sings, in her music, the song she writes, she's about recovering our Black history, and she's very committed to that. And she uses her songwriting as a way to help do that. And she doesn't think of herself as an historian, but to an uneducated person, you would think of her as an historian because of the way she's able to make history come alive through the storytelling of her songs, which is a so much more, emotion hitting way than learning it out of a textbook that, by the way, doesn't exist, because that's the problem.
Right. Yes. Right.
So she writes these songs and she sings and she performs these songs, and she also, in her voice, she can so easily embody a character, not just herself, and that's a thing that's just stunning. So this opera, she was asked to write if she would be interested in writing an opera, and the opera is about Omar ibn Said. And Omar was a Muslim cleric from Senegal who was kidnapped and brought over in the Middle Passage and enslaved in the Carolinas in the early 1800s. But he could read and write Arabic. And in an era when many of the slave owners couldn't read or write, that was pretty unusual when they discovered it. So he ended up being, so then it brought up this interesting dynamic between him and the person who enslaved him, where there was some respect on one hand, but it's not like he wasn't a slave, which is a bit ironic. But the owner was a very religious person, which heightens the irony. So the owner was determined that Omar convert to Christianity because,
a real religion.
Yeah, a real religion. I mean, come on. but at the same, so there was that. But then he also encouraged him to write his autobiography. And he was called, and he lived to a very old age, and he was called Uncle Moro on the plantation at the time of his death. So he had some level of, of respect inside of enslavement.
Yes.
So this irony is a great subject for opera, because opera is an art that, and many of the people who are listening to this now may hate opera, and I totally get your hate. So because I didn't like opera myself much until I was in my 30s, and I had a degree in music, but that's too bad, because I'm here to change people's minds about it. But opera is it can be like performance art. It can tackle issues that don't make necessarily for good movies, because they don't have the perfect story structure that a movie would, or they take a little deeper dive into a subject than a musical would. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Rhiannon has created. So Rhiannon's idea was that she, typically there'd be a composer who writes the music and a librettist. That's a fancy word for the person who writes the text. And then in musicals, there's someone who writes a book, the part that's not sung. And then in an opera, there might be a dramaturg, someone who works on the story structure. Anyway, Rhiannon's idea was that she thought that she would write the libretto because she is a singer-songwriter and she's so good at lyrics. And she also is a singer, and she's a classically trained opera singer.
Oh, wow.
Which people would never, which is a well-kept secret that she just keeps in her back pocket.
Oh, and by the way.
Yes. Oh, and by the way. And so she just recently starred in her first Porgy and Bess as Bess in her spare time. Then she's also the new leader of Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Ensemble, or it's not Yo-Yo Ma's specifically, but he was the director. Now Rhiannon is the next director. So this is the level of her ability.
Yes. Yeah.
But she felt like she needed help writing the music because opera is different from folk music in a lot of ways. And so she asked me to collaborate with her. And
how did she find you? Did you know her before?
I didn't. We have a mutual friend, a pianist named Laura Downs, whose story is also amazing. Laura is a pianist, but she's also a musical. She tells story through music. She makes connections of people, and Laura has many albums out. She's a advocate of Florence Price, who's an African-American composer whose music hasn't been appreciated and is now experiencing a revival. So Laura had worked with Rhiannon, and she had worked with me. And I guess Laura and Rhiannon got to talking about the opera that Rhiannon was going to write. And Laura said, oh, you should talk to Michael. And Laura didn't know that I had been wanting to write an opera for 20 years. And so when Rhiannon said, would you collaborate? I'm like, yes. What's the idea? Because she's such a gifted artist, and just her sense of how she would have, she thought, I should write the libretto and then collaborate on them. It's one of those artistic things where you listen to your heart and you think outside the box in a way to solve a problem. And so she wrote the whole libretto. She found this amazing storyline of Omar's story that was both in his autobiography and also not in his autobiography. And I don't know that she's ever done that before, but she just followed her instinct, and the result is amazing. And she sang many of the sort of aria sections, more song-like sections. She would just sing to me in recordings. And then my approach was, what's needed to turn all of this into an opera? Like, what are the missing pieces that I can provide?
Because opera is a form that has certain, like, what could be missing? I mean, are there certain things that need to be in an opera to have it be an opera?
Well, it all depends what your definition is. It's an art. So the answer to art is whatever the heck you want. You could. No, what we did was Rhiannon and I thought about what it is we want an opera to be. And because she is an opera singer, she has an expectation that opera be like an opera, meaning traditional in whatever senses those are. And also because this opera stars a mostly Black cast and is told from a Black perspective, we didn't feel like having the opera be traditional in other ways would compromise it. We felt like there are already ways in which this opera is very surprising to people.
Right.
So we don't need to worry about that. We can you choose from the unconventional on that side, and then the conventional in some ways musically. So that meant that there's a full orchestra. There's there are people of certain vocal types, like tenors and baritones and mezzo sopranos and sopranos, and there are and so she would sing. And also, like, Rhiannon sings and plays an instrument, and that's where she writes her songs, and she doesn't necessarily write them down first in notation. Whereas I'm someone who, because that's how I was trained, that's something I do just naturally, whether it's first or last. So part of what I did was do that. And then there's an orchestra, and she, plays fiddle and banjo. And so there's a whole need to create, and an orchestra in an opera doesn't just accompany the singing. The orchestra needs to participate in a way that's three-dimensional. The music needs to feel not just like it's a translation of, it's hard to explain, but there's a three-dimensional need for the music. So it's not, they may be in the pit and you don't see them, but it's very much, the singing is part of the instrumental music and vice versa.
And vice versa, yeah.
And then there's the thing about narrative music. And narrative music is really just like film music. It's music that exists to depict action, or depict an emotional curve. You know, a character begins in a certain emotional place and they go to another place, and the music helps take them there, or helps explain to the audience that they're there.
This is
So,
where they're going, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so songs are not, you know, music for film is required to be that way, or it's 90% of the time that way. It's narrative. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's more like a music video where a piece of music just sets a vibe, you know. But most film music is narrative. Well, most songs are setting a vibe. You know, a song is a moment in time that sets us a vibe. So I ended up, when there's dramatic things that happen, the music needs to be dramatic and tell the story in that way that dramatic music does. And so that's where my skills came in, is helping bring there are sections that are very song-like, and a lot of those were written, you know, Rhiannon came up with a whole idea of how that song would unfold, and then I would, you know, cast it in the orchestra and in the setting of the opera. And then there are other sections that are dramatic, and that's mostly me doing what I do. And the idea is that it's, even though I'm telling you what I did, when you listen to it, I don't want you for a second to think that it's not what, you know. So the way I would do it is to write with her colors, you know, is to take the colors of that she's leading with and use those colors to fill in the details of things around it, so that it all feels like one thought when it's all the way.